All right, there is a little bit of discussion between atheists in particular about whether or not we can know something exists. It's a logical argument that I've seen a few times. Um, and it all comes down to you can't prove a negative, so therefore you're agnostic. Or some people claim there is no God, and other people find this logically contradictory because you can't know for sure and you cannot prove something doesn't exist. So therefore you must logically conclude that you're agnostic. So let me break it down a little bit. So there's the Gnostic and agnostic, to know or not to know, and then there's atheist or theist, which is belief in a God or lack of belief in a God. And I think that actually most people fall under Gnostic atheist for very specific reasons. So allow me to break it down for you. And for those of you that have read Spinoza's Ethics, if you haven't, I recommend it. But it describes the attributes that would be God. The Jewish God in particular is what they're describing. But there's a description of attributes largely around the infinite, that all-knowing, all-seeing, that type of thing, sort of, where the infinite, boundless aspects of matter, even though we know matter is finite, breaks down to nothingness eventually, and then reforms and whatnot. Entropy kind of kills everything that it touches. Essentially, the infinite concept to finite things is God, I guess is how you can describe it. Another philosophical argument is the teleological, I believe it is, where God is the first mover, the starter of the universe, and then just kind of stood back and watched everything happen from there on. But it was all orchestrated and planned out, and then he hit the go button. So he wrote the code and hit start. These types of descriptions are theoretically possible, and I'll get to why they're theoretically possible in a second, but I wanted to break down the types of things that you would see first. So the reason why I would claim to be a Gnostic atheist is because of the description of attributes. So you have a set of attributes, you assign them to your God, and if those attributes are logically contradictory or they're a theoretical framework to which you can test, then we can prove the existence or the null hypothesis, as it were. So let me structure this in a way that's a scientific theoretical framework. Then this might make more sense because it's an epistemological approach to this concept. So, say you're arguing with a Christian. Let's start with there because they're the easiest people to argue with and everybody in the United States knows them. They're the largest religion on the planet. So, easy. Just about most people have read the Bible at some point or another and went, wow, that's a bunch of bullshit. However, in the Bible, there are descriptive attributes which are attributed to the God. Well, in a scientific theoretical framework, you are giving a description of things. The theory of evolution is a theoretical framework, a description of evolution. The theory of gravity, the theory of general relativity, the theory of motion. All these things are descriptions of natural things. They're descriptions of stuff. Well, I would then argue that the attribute, the description of their God, as set forth in the Bible, is a theoretical framework to which we can test. And if anybody knows how this scientific method works, essentially you have to start with two hypotheses. Either you're going to prove that something exists, or you must not reject the null. You must accept the null, which is this thing does not exist. So you're always trying to prove that something does exist rather than something that does not. The default position is it does not exist until you can prove otherwise. At least in scientific notations, that's how it works. So, with the description of God in the Christian context, we have a bunch of attributes about how he is. If you go around the Trinity line, for example, God is Jesus, Jesus is the Holy Spirit, and they're all kind of connected. You can experience God in some manner, or some form. You can have personal revelation or experiences, prayer works, and whatnot, but we know the arguments to these. For example, why doesn't God heal amputees? If he's all healing, he can heal the sick and wounded and cure cancer, then cancer shouldn't exist. If he can heal the sick and wounded, then why are devout Christian amputees never growing their limbs back? Then there's the prayer working. We've tested prayers a number of times throughout our generations and found that prayer has as much to do with working as chance and the roll of the dice have to do with you hitting craps every time. Snake eyes, whatever. Roll a d20. Who's hitting the 20? It has the same probability, essentially, unless you're cheating. Well, the attributes that are aligned within this particular framework are something that we can test to prove that your existence of God is there. Otherwise, we must say that God does not exist until you can prove otherwise. Well, this is a Gnostic position. You will know that God does not exist until you can prove that God does. This is why I'd say most people are Gnostic atheists when it comes to pretty much every God that has given a description. Allah is no different. He has a description in the Quran. The Quran has flaws. The description of their God equally has flaws. And the logical contradictions of the description of Allah negate his existence, because the descriptions in there, taken to a theoretical framework, are testable and fail. So you must accept the null hypothesis. You cannot... It's not accept the null hypothesis. You cannot reject the null hypothesis, meaning that your God doesn't exist until you can prove otherwise. So I think this goes for pretty much every God. As Lawrence Krauss put it oh so eloquently, you believe, or you don't believe in 99 gods that have existed throughout history. I just went one more. Well, I wouldn't put it to the measure of belief for me. I tend to stick to the logical, the things we can prove. The epistemological approach is so much better, in my opinion. I want to know more. Well, if we take the descriptions, we put them into a theoretical framework, we test those hypotheses, if you will, based on the theory and the attributes given to us to test, and we're come up short, there you go. For example, the omnipresent God, the one that God is everywhere, but God is always good. And evil cannot exist in the presence of God, yet evil exists according to our own perception of reality. There is evil in this world. Therefore, your God can exist nowhere. If God exists, or if evil cannot exist in his presence, either evil should not ever exist, or your God does not exist, because evil negates his existence. Evil would not be able to exist if he's omnipresent. Therefore, he's not omnipresent. That attribute cannot substantiate the existence of a God. You must now unable to reject the null, that your God does not exist, based on the omnipresence framework, the theory, or the hypothesis, rather. Same goes for omniscience, all-knowing, or all-powerful, making the rock so big that you can't lift it. If God could do that, now he's made something that he cannot do, and that's a logical inconsistency to the possibility of being all-powerful. Nor can he destroy it, just to have added fun to that. But these arguments are things that we can demonstrate, test, and prove that no, your God does not exist. You still must accept the null hypothesis, and the null is always the neutral position, which is your God does not exist. This is why I claim to be, and will remain, Gnostic atheist to specific gods, mind you. So this includes Vishnu, Shiva, Allah, Yahweh, Jesus, all those. They have attributes, they have descriptions, we've tested them, they come up short, they don't exist. Now, where I remain agnostic, and I think most people would probably, if not all atheists, would probably fall into this category, is to say, we cannot necessarily negate the possibility of a God existing. I think the problem therein lies that the a God would have to have descriptions which make it worshipable yet worthless. The God that never intervenes. The God that started the universe and then stepped away and watched. Just waiting for his chosen people to come back and do whatever. This type of God theoretically could exist because the things that they ask us to test move into what I call the argument from ignorance, which is to say that these things are unknowable positions. We should never know, we could never know potentially, at least in our lifetimes, the start of the universe. It's just something that we will never know. The same goes for a number of other things as well, right? God exists only in the supernatural, which means he could never interact with the natural world, because once that happens, we know that to be a natural phenomenon, something we can test, therefore prove that God exists. But since things that happen in the natural world are testable and are found to be a natural occurring thing, evolution, for example, being the easiest example, gravity being another, that we understand how these forces work now. Before we didn't, now we do. So the God of the gaps, as it's called, shrinks. And if you're giving attributes of the gaps to God, he's going to disappear into obscurity eventually, because there's going to be only a few places that is going to remain unknowable, like the start of language. Unless we go to another planet and observe the evolution over a couple million years of a mammalian or primate or reptilian or whatever species go from unable to communicate to developing language, we'll not know how, we don't know how or when or why it even starts. Like, what's the evolutionary influence for language? We kind of have 3 or 4 hypotheses, but those are things that you cannot test because those are things that are not physical form. The words may leave my mouth and go sit on the internet, but until I do that, I'm just speaking them to a camera. They don't exist, and they're not tangible. Now, recording things are, but you can't grasp a word out of the air, if you get my meaning. But anyways, I thought I'd lay this down for you. This is the logical conundrum that I call the Gnostic versus Agnostic atheist. I find agnostic atheism to be a position where they are afraid to admit that specific gods don't exist, and I find that to be a logical flaw, because those specific gods we have tested ad nauseum and found that they don't exist. If they revel in scientific notation and scientific discovery and theory, then one must logically conclude that we cannot reject the null hypothesis, and that is to say there is no Christian God, for example. So I hope you enjoyed this one. I thought I'd lay this down there, and hopefully it makes sense to you. If not, ping me on Twitter, Facebook, Minds, preferably Minds. I'm on there a lot. And I'll have the discussion. I'll explain it to you. I'll do it in a Socratic method, because it seems easier to convey these type of ideas. So thank you for watching.
The class is finished today.